The heavy steel door echoed through the underground vault. The sound was so loud, so final, that everyone in the room froze. Camilla stood at the entrance, her hand still extended, her face caught between shock and something else. Something darker. The royal guard didn't move. His jaw was set, his eyes forward. He had just done something no guard had ever done before. He had shut the vault door in the face of the queen consort. Behind him, deep in the vault's climate-controlled darkness, sat row after row of royal treasures, crowns, jewels, artifacts worth more than most people could imagine. And somewhere in that maze of history and power was the Spencer Tiara, the tiara that had graced Princess Diana's head on her wedding day, the tiara that didn't belong to the crown, the tiara that Camilla had just asked to see. The silence in that moment was unbearable. 3 other staff members stood nearby, their faces pale. They had heard the request. They had seen the guard's response. And now they were witnesses to something that would either end a career or change everything. Camilla's voice cut through the quiet. "Excuse me?" Her tone was measured, but there was ice beneath it. "Did you just close that door?" The guard's name was Thomas Hendricks. He had served the crown for 17 years. He had stood post in blizzards, through ceremonies, beside royalty during moments of triumph and grief. He was trained to obey, trained to disappear into the background, trained never to question. But today, something inside him had snapped. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story and want more emotional, true life tales like this, hit that subscribe button. You won't regret it. Thomas finally spoke. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled at his sides. "Your Majesty, I cannot grant access to that item." The air seemed to thicken. One of the staff members, a young woman named Claire, took a small step backward. She knew what this meant. Defying a direct request from someone of Camilla's position was grounds for immediate dismissal. Possibly worse, but Thomas didn't back down. He stood there, shoulders square, facing the woman who could destroy his life with a single phone call. Camilla's eyes narrowed. "On whose authority?" "On the authority of the Spencer family, ma'am." His words were quiet but firm. "The tiara is on loan. It is not property of the crown. I have explicit instructions that it is not to be handled or displayed without written consent from Earl Spencer himself." For a moment, no one breathed. The vault's ventilation system hummed softly in the background. Somewhere above them, tourists walked through the public areas of the palace, completely unaware of the confrontation happening below their feet. Camilla took a step closer. Her face was unreadable now, a mask of composure. But her voice had an edge. "I am well aware of who owns the tiara, Thomas. I am not asking to wear it. I am asking to see it." Thomas didn't flinch. "With respect, ma'am, the terms are very clear. No access without written authorization." The tension was suffocating. Claire felt her heart pounding in her chest. She had worked at the palace for 3 years and had never seen anything like this. Guards didn't say no. They didn't challenge. They certainly didn't stand their ground against royalty. But Thomas wasn't just any guard. And this wasn't just any tiara. What happened next would send shockwaves through the palace. And the reasons behind Thomas's refusal would reveal a secret that had been buried for decades. Asterisk.
Asterisk?
Camilla stared at Thomas for what felt like an eternity. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Her footsteps clicked against the marble floor, each step deliberate and controlled. The sound faded as she disappeared up the corridor. The moment she was gone, Claire rushed to Thomas's side. "Are you insane?" She whispered harshly. "Do you know what you just did?" Thomas didn't answer. He was still staring at the vault door, his face pale but resolute. Another staff member, an older man named Peter, shook his head slowly. "You're finished, son. Pack your things. By tonight, you'll be gone." But Thomas didn't move. He knew what he had done. He knew the consequences. And he knew why he had done it. What no one else in that room understood was that Thomas had been given specific orders 3 months earlier. Orders that came from someone even higher than Camilla. Orders that were never written down, never recorded. Orders that were delivered in a private conversation that Thomas was instructed never to reveal. The order had come from King Charles himself. It happened on a rainy Tuesday morning. Thomas had been summoned to a private study, a room he had never entered before. The king was alone, standing by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "Thomas," he had said quietly, not turning around, "I need to ask something of you. Something that stays between us." Thomas had stood at attention, his heart racing. "Of course, Your Majesty." Charles turned then, and Thomas saw something in his eyes he hadn't expected. Sadness. Deep, old sadness that seemed to weigh on him like a physical thing. "The Spencer Tiara," Charles said slowly. "It's here, in the vault. On loan from my former brother-in-law, as you know." No, Thomas nodded. He knew the tiara's history. Everyone did. It was the tiara Diana had worn, the one that had become a symbol of her grace, her beauty, her tragedy. Charles continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "There may come a time when someone asks to see it. Someone close to me." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If that happens, I need you to refuse." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "Your Majesty, I know what I'm asking," Charles interrupted gently. "I know it puts you in an impossible position. But this is important, Thomas. That tiara represents something that cannot be touched. Not by anyone. Not for any reason. Do you understand?" Thomas had understood. Or at least he thought he had. He understood that this was about Diana, about memory, about respect, about guilt, perhaps. "I understand, sir," he had said. Charles nodded slowly. "Good, and Thomas? If questioned, you cite the Spencer family's terms. Nothing more." This conversation never happened. Now, standing in the vault corridor with Claire and Peter staring at him like he had lost his mind, Thomas realized the full weight of what the king had asked him to do. He had been made a shield, a barrier between the past and the present, between what was and what some wished could be forgotten. 2 hours later, Thomas was summoned to an office on the second floor. His supervisor, a stern woman named Margaret Davies, sat behind her desk with her hands folded. Her expression was granite. "Sit down, Thomas," he sat. His career was over, he knew it, but he felt no regret. Margaret studied him for a long moment. "What you did today was extraordinary, and extraordinarily foolish." "Yes, ma'am. The Queen Consort is very displeased, I imagine so, ma'am." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "She has requested your immediate dismissal." Thomas nodded slowly. He had expected nothing less. But then Margaret did something unexpected. She smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it was real. "However," she continued, "I received a phone call 20 minutes ago. From His Majesty? He has declined her request. You will remain at your post." Thomas felt the air rush out of his lungs. "I don't understand." "You don't need to understand," Margaret said quietly. "You just need to do your job. And Thomas, whatever you think you know about why this happened, keep it to yourself. Some battles are fought in silence." Thomas left the office in a daze. He walked through the palace corridors, past the portraits of kings and queens, past the tourists and guards and staff. He thought about Diana, about Charles, about the weight of history and the price of loyalty, and he wondered what would happen next. Because he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The story should have ended there. Thomas kept his job. The tiara remained locked away. Life in the palace returned to its careful rhythm of ceremony and silence. But secrets have a way of spreading, even in places built to contain them. Within days, whispers moved through the palace staff like smoke. A guard had defied the Queen Consort. The king had protected him. Something was happening. Something about Diana's tiara. Most people didn't know the details. They didn't need to. The outline was enough to fuel speculation. In the kitchens, during shift changes, in the quiet moments between duties, people talked. Claire, who had witnessed everything, tried to stay quiet. But late one night, during a break, she confided in her closest friend, another staff member named Rachel. "I was there," Claire said, her voice hushed. I saw the whole thing. He just shut the door. Right in her face. Rachel's eyes widened. Why would he do that? He said it was about the Spencer family's rules. But Rachel. Claire leaned closer. I don't think that was the real reason. The way he stood there, the way he didn't even hesitate. It was like he knew something. Like he was following orders from someone else. From who? Claire shook her head. I don't know. But whoever it was, they have more power than she does. The conversation should have ended there. But Rachel told someone. That person told someone else. And within a week, whispers had reached the ears of people outside the palace. A journalist named Emma Pritchard had been covering royal affairs for 15 years. She had sources inside the palace, people who fed her information in exchange for discretion and careful handling. When she heard about the tiara incident, her instincts flared. This wasn't just palace gossip. This was something deeper. Emma began digging. She made phone calls. She reached out to former staff members, historians, anyone who might know about the Spencer Tiara's current status. What she discovered was a trail of careful silence. The tiara had been loaned to the crown 8 years earlier for a specific exhibition. The loan was supposed to last 3 months, but it had never been returned. Earl Spencer's office had made quiet inquiries over the years, but each time they were told the tiara was being preserved, protected, kept in optimal conditions. They were assured it would be returned when the time was right, but the time never seemed to come. Emma found something else. A source told her that Camilla had requested to wear the tiara for a private photo shoot 2 years earlier. The request had been quietly denied by palace officials, citing the Spencer family's ownership. Camilla had apparently dropped the matter until 3 months ago. That's when something changed. Emma's source, former palace administrator who spoke on condition of anonymity, told her about increased tension. There were discussions about the tiara's future, the source said, about whether it should be returned or kept. Some people felt it should stay with the crown as a historical artifact. Others felt it was wrong to keep something so personal to Diana. What did the king think? Emma asked. The source hesitated. The king was very clear. The tiara goes back to the Spencer family, but not yet. He wanted it kept secure until he decided the right moment. Because the source said slowly, he didn't want anyone else touching it. Especially not as a symbol of replacing Diana. Emma felt a chill. This wasn't about property or protocol. This was about memory and guilt and the ghost of a woman who still haunted the monarchy. She began writing. Her article would be carefully worded, based on anonymous sources and careful inference. But it would tell the story of a king protecting his first wife's legacy. The story of a guard who became an unlikely hero. The story of a tiara that represented more than jewels in history. But before Emma could publish, something unexpected happened. Earl Spencer himself issued a statement. It was brief, formal, and carefully neutral. He announced that the Spencer tiara would be formally returned to the Spencer family in a private ceremony within the month. He thanked the crown for its careful stewardship and noted that the tiara would be displayed at Althorpe, the Spencer family estate, as part of a permanent Diana exhibition. The statement didn't mention Camilla. It didn't mention the vault incident. It didn't mention Thomas, but everyone who knew the story understood what it meant. The king had made his decision. The tiara was going home, and with it a message was being sent. Some things are not for the taking. Some legacies are untouchable. Emma published her article anyway, but it was softer now, framed as a story about the tiara's return rather than the confrontation. Still, the implications were there for those who wanted to see them. The public response was immediate and emotional. Social media exploded with comments. People who had loved Diana saw the return as justice. People who supported Camilla saw it as unnecessary drama. People who simply loved a good royal story debated every detail. But inside the palace, the mood was quiet, tense. Everyone knew that something had shifted. A line had been drawn. And Thomas, the guard who had stood his ground, had become a symbol of something larger than himself. Asterisk, the day the tiara left the palace was cold and gray. Rain misted across the courtyard as a private car pulled up to a side entrance. No press, no ceremony. Just a small group of officials and one representative from the Spencer family. Thomas was there. He had been assigned to oversee the transfer. Some saw it as an honor. Others wondered if it was punishment. A reminder of the chaos he had caused. The tiara was brought up from the vault in a locked case. Thomas watched as the conservator carefully checked the seals, verified the documentation, and prepared it for transport. The case was small, almost unremarkable. You wouldn't know it held something so valuable, so weighted with meaning as they carried it to the car. Thomas caught a glimpse through the case's small viewing window. The tiara glittered even in the dim light. Diamonds and pearls arranged in that distinctive shape, the same shape that had crowned Diana on the happiest day of her life. Before everything fell apart, the Spencer representative, a quiet woman in her 50s named Mrs. Helena Blackwood, signed the final papers. She looked at Thomas and offered a small smile. "Thank you," she said simply. Thomas nodded. He didn't know what else to say. As the car drove away, Thomas felt something release in his chest. It was done. The tiara was gone. Whatever test he had been put through, whatever purpose he had served, was finished. But he was wrong. That evening, Thomas received a message. He was requested to attend a private meeting the following morning. The location was unusual. Not an office, not a conference room, but the king's private sitting room. Thomas barely slept that night. He replayed everything in his mind. The vault. The confrontation. The phone call that saved his job. What more could there be? The next morning, he was escorted through parts of the palace he had never seen. Quiet corridors, personal spaces, areas where the public never went. A private secretary led him to a door, knocked softly, and gestured for him to enter. King Charles stood by the window, much as he had been 3 months earlier when he first gave Thomas his orders. But this time, when he turned, his expression was different. Lighter somehow, relieved. "Thomas," he said warmly. "Thank you for coming, Your Majesty." Thomas bowed slightly, his heart hammering. Charles gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. This won't take long." Thomas sat stiffly, unsure what to expect. The king remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with what to say. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "I owe you an apology." Thomas felt his breath catch. "Your Majesty, no asterisk, yes?" Charles interrupted gently. "I do. I put you in an impossible position. I asked you to take a stand that should have been mine to take. And you did it without hesitation, even knowing it could cost you everything. I was following orders. Sir, you were following orders that I should never have given." Charles moved to sit across from him, something no one had probably ever seen a king do with a guard. "Thomas, do you know why I asked you to refuse access to that tiara?" Thomas hesitated. He assumed. "It was about protecting Princess Diana's memory." Charles nodded slowly. "That's part of it, but it's more than that." He looked down at his hands. "I failed Diana in many ways when she was alive. The world knows that. I know that. My sons know that. And I have spent years trying to reconcile what I did, what I didn't do, with the man I want to be now." Thomas didn't know how to respond. This level of honesty from the king was unprecedented. Charles continued. "When that tiara came back to us for the exhibition, I should have returned it immediately, but I kept it. I told myself it was for preservation, for security. But the truth is, I kept it because—" He paused, searching for words. "Because it felt like keeping a piece of her here, like some small way of honoring what she meant. What she still means." The room was utterly silent, except for the distant sound of traffic outside. "And when I learned that Camilla wanted to see it, possibly use it—" Charles shook his head. "I couldn't allow it. Not because Camilla doesn't deserve respect or dignity. She does. But that tiara represents something that cannot be transferred. It belongs to Diana's memory, to her sons, to her family. It was wrong to keep it here, and it would have been unforgivable to let it become something else." Thomas felt the weight of the king's words. This wasn't about protocol. This was about grief. About trying to do the right thing, even years too late. So I asked you to be the one to say no, Charles said. Because I couldn't. I couldn't confront her directly. I couldn't create that conflict. And that was cowardice on my part. With respect, Your Majesty, Thomas said carefully, I don't think it was cowardice. I think it was complicated. Charles smiled faintly. You're kind to say so. He stood, and Thomas quickly stood as well. The tiara is where it belongs now. And you, Thomas, have done something I couldn't. You stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Even when it was easier to look away. He extended his hand. Thomas, stunned, shook it. Thank you, Charles, said simply. As Thomas left the room, his mind was reeling. He had expected reprimand or dismissal. Instead, he had received an apology and a handshake from the King of England. He walked through the palace corridors in a daze, barely seeing the artwork or the staff he passed. What he didn't know was that this conversation, this private moment of honesty, would never be spoken of again. It would remain between him and the king. A secret buried under layers of protocol and discretion. Asterisk 3 weeks after the tiara returned to Althorpe. Thomas was back at his regular duties. The palace had returned to its usual rhythm. The whispers had faded. Life moved on, as it always does. But not everyone had moved on. Camilla had remained silent through the entire affair. No public statements. No visible reaction. She attended her engagements with the same composed smile, the same practiced grace. To the outside world, nothing had changed. But inside the palace, those who knew her could see the difference. There was a coldness in her interactions with certain staff members. A distance that hadn't been there before. She didn't mention the tiara. She didn't mention Thomas. But her silence spoke volumes. Claire, who still worked in the same section as Thomas, noticed the change. She hasn't looked at you once, she whispered to him one afternoon. Not a single glance in 3 weeks? Thomas didn't respond. He had learned that some battles are won not by confrontation, but by quiet endurance. What Thomas didn't know was that Camilla had her own version of this story. Her own reasons. Her own pain. Late one evening, Camilla sat in her private chambers with her closest friend and advisor, a woman named Lady Amanda Rothschild. They had been friends for 40 years, long before crowns and titles and the weight of history. Everyone thinks I wanted that tiara for vanity, Camilla said quietly, staring into her teacup. They think I wanted to wear it, to claim it somehow. Amanda said nothing, just listened. She knew her friend needed to speak. I didn't want to wear it, Camilla continued, her voice breaking slightly. I wanted to see it, just once. Because I wanted to understand what she wore that day. What she felt, what it meant to walk into that cathedral knowing the world was watching, knowing your life was about to change forever. She set down her teacup, her hands trembling. People think I don't think about her, that I don't carry her presence with me every single day. But how could I not? She's everywhere, in the faces of his sons, in the way people look at me, in every room of this palace. Amanda reached across and took her hand. I know. I wanted to see the tiara because I thought maybe, somehow, it would help me understand. Help me find a way to, Camilla's voice trailed off, to coexist with her ghost. This was the truth that no one saw. The truth that couldn't be printed in articles or whispered through corridors. Camilla wasn't trying to replace Diana. She was trying to survive in the shadow of a woman who would forever be perfect in death, forever untouchable. But understanding doesn't erase consequences. And in the eyes of the public, in the eyes of Diana's sons, in the eyes of history, the message had been sent. The tiara was protected. Diana was protected. Some boundaries would not be crossed. Meanwhile, at Althorpe, the tiara had been installed in a new display. Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, had created a permanent exhibition dedicated to his sister's life and legacy. The tiara sat in a climate-controlled case, lit from above, surrounded by photographs and artifacts from her remarkable life. Thousands of visitors came to see it. They stood in front of the display, some crying, some smiling. all touched by the presence of something that had once graced the head of a woman they had loved, a woman who had been flawed and human and extraordinary. Among the visitors, one quiet. Tuesday afternoon was a young woman named Sophie. She was 26, a teacher from Manchester, and she'd been 9 years old when Diana died. She remembered the shock, the sadness. The way adults around her had wept, Sophie stood in front of the tiara for a long time. She thought about fairy tales and how they never show you what happens after the wedding. They never show you the loneliness, the betrayal, the slow breaking of a heart in front of millions of witnesses. She deserved better, Sophie whispered to her friend beside her. And in that moment, the tiara became more than jewels. It became a symbol of something lost. Something that couldn't be reclaimed or replaced or forgotten. Back at the palace, life continued. Thomas performed his duties with quiet efficiency. He never spoke about what had happened. When other guards asked, he simply said it was a matter of protocol. Nothing more, but sometimes late at night, when he was alone, Thomas thought about that moment in the vault. The echo of the door closing. The look in Camilla's eyes. The weight of carrying out an order that changed everything. He thought about the king's apology. About the complexity of love and loyalty and guilt. About how the living carry the weight of the dead, sometimes for their entire lives. And he thought about Diana. A woman he had never met, but whose presence had shaped this entire ordeal. A woman who had walked through these same halls, worn that same tiara, and lived a life that the world thought it understood but never really did. Thomas understood something now that he hadn't before. History isn't made by grand gestures or dramatic moments alone. It's made by small choices. By a guard refusing to open a door. By a king protecting a memory. By a tiara returning home. These were the moments that mattered. These were the stories that would be whispered for years to come. Long after everyone involved had moved on or passed away, the tiara was safe. Diana's memory was protected. And Thomas, a simple guard who had done his duty, would forever be part of a story much larger than himself. 6 months passed. The story faded from headlines and social media feeds. New royal dramas emerged to capture public attention. The tiara incident became a footnote, a curious moment that people half remembered when Diana's name came up in conversation. But for those directly involved, the impact lingered. Thomas received a commendation for his service. It came without explanation, just a formal letter and a small ceremony with other palace staff. No one mentioned the tiara. No one needed to. Everyone knew his relationship with other guards had changed subtly. Some treated him with new respect. Others kept their distance, wary of someone who had proven willing to defy expectations. Thomas didn't mind either way. He had learned that doing the right thing often means standing alone. One afternoon, Claire approached him during a break. They hadn't spoken much since that day in the vault, both trying to move forward, to forget the tension and fear. I wanted to tell you something, she said quietly. My grandmother worked at Kensington Palace. In the 80s and 90s, she knew Diana. Thomas looked up, surprised. I didn't know that, Claire nodded. She never talked about it much. You know how staff are. Discretion and all that. But after everything that happened with the tiara, she told me a story. She sat down beside him, her voice soft. She said that Diana used to walk through the palace late at night when she couldn't sleep. She'd wander the halls, looking at portraits and paintings. Sometimes she'd stop in front of pictures of former queens and princesses. And my grandmother heard her say something once, almost to herself. What did she say? She said, they all look so happy in these paintings. I wonder if any of them actually were. Claire's eyes were sad. My grandmother said that's when she realized how lonely Diana was, how trapped she felt, even with all the beauty and privilege around her. Thomas felt a weight settle in his chest. Why are you telling me this? Because what you did, Claire said, protecting that tiara, refusing to let it become something it wasn't meant to be. My grandmother said Diana would have appreciated that. She would have wanted her things, her memories, to stay hers. Not to be claimed or repurposed or used by people who didn't understand what they meant. Thomas didn't know what to say. He had never thought about it that way. He had simply followed orders, protected protocol. But maybe it had meant more than that. "Thank you," he finally said. Claire smiled and walked away, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. Meanwhile, in a completely different world, Prince William and Prince Harry each received private notifications that the Spencer Tiara had been returned to their uncle's estate. Neither made public statements, but those close to them said they were pleased. Relieved, even. For William and Harry, their mother's legacy had become a battleground they never asked for. Every item, every photograph, every story was claimed and reclaimed by various sides. The tiara's return was a small victory, a reminder that some things still belonged to them. To the truth of who she had been, away from the cameras and the palace politics at Althorpe. Earl Spencer stood before the tiara's display one evening after the visitors had gone. His sister had worn this on the day she married into the most famous family in the world. She had been so young, so hopeful. She couldn't have known what was coming. He thought about the phone call he had received from the palace months earlier, informing him of the incident. He had been angry at first, angry that the tiara had been requested without permission, angry that it had taken a guard's refusal to protect his sister's belongings. But then he had spoken with Charles. A private conversation, brief and careful. Charles had apologized. He had explained his reasoning. And Earl Spencer had heard something in the king's voice that surprised him. Genuine remorse. Genuine respect for Diana's memory. It didn't erase the past. It didn't fix what had been broken. But it was something. A small gesture of acknowledgement that Diana had mattered. Still mattered back at the palace. Camilla attended a charity gala. She smiled for cameras. She spoke with grace and warmth. She was everything a queen consort should be. But when she returned to her chambers that night, she looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone who would forever be compared to a ghost. Someone who would never wear certain crowns, never touch certain jewels, never fully escape the shadow of a woman who had left the world too soon. She had made peace with it, mostly. But peace doesn't mean the absence of pain. It just means learning to carry it with dignity. And Thomas? Thomas continued his work. He stood his posts. He followed his orders. He lived a quiet life. It's a kind of life that doesn't make headlines or history books, but he carried with him the knowledge that he had. It's been part of something important. That in a moment when he could have looked away, could have obeyed without question, he had chosen to stand firm. To protect something that mattered even if he didn't fully understand why at the time. Years from now, when people tell stories about Diana, some will mention the tiara. They'll talk about her wedding day, about the way she looked like a fairy tale princess, about the tragedy of what came after, and a few people, very few, will know another story. The story of a guard who shut a vault door, the story of a king who protected a memory, the story of a tiara that went home. These stories live in the margins of history. They're whispered in palace corridors and written in articles that fade from memory. But they're real. They matter. They remind us that behind every crown, every title, every public face, there are humans struggling with impossible choices. Thomas understood that now. And on quiet nights, when he walked through the palace halls, he sometimes thought of Diana walking those same paths. Lost and lonely and searching for something she would never quite find, he hoped, wherever she was, that she knew. That someone had stood up for her. That her memory was protected. That she wasn't forgotten. And in that hope, in that simple act of standing his ground, Thomas had done something that royalty often cannot do. He had been honest. He had been brave. And he had proven that some things, some memories, are worth protecting, no matter the cost.